I'm happy to spend this time with you this morning and this week. As always, we're starting our day hoping everyone is feeling healthy and slowly stabilizing with this new normal that we are currently in. As we shared yesterday when we were together, we are very happy today to have our Facebook Live that was actually planned before any of this happened to be a virtual event with the intent of it really being able to get out there into the community. We today are kicking off our Why Women Vote series, which is part of an initiative from our YWCA National to really engage women in our community and educate them on issues that they should be thinking about when they are in the voting booth in November. And the the whole project was based on a report that our national organization commissioned, where they looked and interviewed women around the country as to what are the issues that are most important to them for this big election. And we identified a few of them for us to move forward with. We are so happy today to focus this virtual conversation today on climate change. And my guest is Dominique Thomas, who you can see on the screen there. Hello, Dominique.
Hi, hello everyone.
And Dominique is an activist, an organizer, and a researcher, a Black feminist, and she is based in Harlem, New York. So tell us, Dominique, how are things in Harlem, New York, and your neck of the woods in this strange time that we're in right now?
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been too bad thus far. I already work remotely, so that transition really hasn't been too bad. More of the in-person, community gathering obviously can't be happening right now. But I would say like grocery stores are a little barren compared to how they were before. And so there has been, a lot of help that's been happening in Harlem around like mutual aid programs and things like that. So that's been a blessing for people who are in a vulnerable position. But I'm hoping that we can get through this pandemic um, unscathed.
Yes, agreed. Blessings to all and good thoughts everywhere for that, for sure.
Mhm.
So, Dominique serves as the New York and Mid-Atlantic organizer for 350.org. Do you want to tell us a little bit about 350.org, Dominique?
Sure. It's so 350. It was started in 2009 by Bill McKibben. It's a international climate organization who directly goes after the fossil fuel industry for their nefarious effects on climate. And so it's international. In the US, we have local groups who are part of our organization, who are affiliated with us, who are doing really amazing work in their regions. There's even a local group in New Jersey, which I can talk about a little bit more. But yeah, so a lot of great work that's come out of 350, really interested in grassroots organizing and the connection between climate and racial justice and equity.
That's wonderful. And we at the YWCA is, as you know, our mission is to eliminate racism and empower women. And
Hmm.
as we were looking at these events and these opportunities to do voter education that came out of this Why Women Vote report that our national
Hmm.
organization had done, we really decided to focus on climate change as one of the discussions because I do think that that's an area that people may not always make the connection and understand
Hmm.
how it aligns with our racial
Hmm.
justice work. And
Hmm.
so this is such a wonderful opportunity to educate our community. So I thank you for taking the time to do that.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah,
the,
thanks for having me.
yeah, I mean, we know that the our work in racial justice is about eradicating systems and policies that
Hmm.
have allowed racism, and quite frankly, that is very similarly aligned with the work that's happening in the climate change world as well, really
Hmm.
eradicating systems
Hmm.
and policies that have really impacted
Right.
climate negatively. So, we also know that with COVID-19, that's, in our midst right now too, that the physical, social, and emotional and economic well-being of marginalized people and communities are really being even more adversely impacted right now as well.
Mhm.
So, it's a strange intersection of timing that, our talk ended up happening right now, but it's definitely
Mhm.
relevant for everyone. And we're grateful that not only do we get to have this conversation live with people in the community watching and able to ask questions and chime in as we're speaking. So those of you watching, please feel free to ask questions, and we will take them during the course of our time together. But this will live on our Facebook page, and folks can watch it and share it later to make sure, again, that we educate as many people as possible on these important issues.
Mhm.
So, with that, as we're, trying to adjust to these times, as I said, our national organization had done this wonderful survey of women and collected information on the voting priorities. And here we are. This is clearly, was identified as
Mhm.
them. So let's jump into it. So tell us a little bit about the big picture. How has the climate change escalated into, how have we gone from kind of climate change conversations to a climate change crisis? How did that happen? And so let's start there.
Yeah, and I think first, like a context to have is that, climate change is not something new,
Right.
right? This is not like a new thing. It's not a new concept. I remember when I was in high school, it wasn't called climate change, it was global warming. I remember
Yeah.
doing projects about it and, global warming. And now when we talk about climate, we're really talking about an all-encompassing term, right? It's really describing the different types of consequences that are occurring because of pollution and deforestation and the burning of fossil fuels. And so when we think about it, what are those consequences? And so when we're burning fossil fuels, we're raising the temperature of the earth, right? And so July 2019 was actually the hottest month in recorded history. Um, and that's scary to think about, right? And so you may think, I'm going outside and it's super warm, nice weather, but there's really negative consequences to having such extreme weather, right? And so we're really in a crisis because I believe that we failed to act in a radical manner when it's come to climate. When you think about sometimes at the local level, sometimes federally, we still have elected officials who deny that climate change is even a real thing, right? They deny the science. They say it's a hoax, or they talk about, well, there's all these positive benefits to climate change. So why should we really worry about it? And they really failed to um, hold the fossil fuel industry accountable for climate and climate disasters, right? And so when we think about, um, so taking into example the increase in temperature, right? It's not going to be uniform, right? Globally. So there's going to be a number of climate disasters that are occurring, and we've seen them. We've seen an increase in hurricanes. We've seen rising sea levels. We've seen wildfires that have devastated Australia, the Amazon, and California. And so we're really already seeing like these really dire impacts of climate, right? And so the World Health Organization um, released a report in which they found that air pollution, which is just one aspect of the fossil fuel economy, right, kills over 7 million people each year. And so we're in a climate crisis. Um, and some scientists have said that, we're already out of time. Some say that, we have about 10 years to make radical changes before um, we reach that point of no return. And so thinking about different communities that are affected, they're already living with climate destruction. We've had climate refugees who've had to migrate because of the effects of climate. In 2018, 60 million people worldwide suffered from consequences of extreme weather and climate change. And that resulted in over 1,600 deaths. And it's not only the effects of it's not only the effects of the extreme weather, but it's also the human effects that it's having. So people are dying, people are being displaced from their homes and their countries. People are having health issues or mental health issues and trauma experience from these different climate disasters. It's also having a negative effect on the economy, right? So hurricanes like Hurricane Michael and Florence caused over $24 billion in destruction to the US economy. And so we really at that point where we're in the crisis, and it may be that we are at that point where we've reached the point of no return. So we really need to be holding fossil fuel industry accountable for the negative effects that burning fossil fuels have had on the planet.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I mean, a couple things that you said just, popped in my head, just talking about kind of the difference in language of global warming to climate change. Also,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a different generation, than you are. And,
Mm-hmm.
and also think about older generations from myself too, that may not be so, different generations, I say across the board, that may not be so plugged into these environmental issues per se,
Mm-hmm.
that may not have made that connection.
Mm-hmm.
That is the evolution
Right.
of that. And also, I 100% agree. I mean, people go outside in February and have a 60-degree day and they're like, oh, this is wonderful. Spring is coming, without really making the connection of, what does that mean? Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's important now, though, that more and more attention is being brought to the issue to educate people, on these things. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and as you said, I mean, there's so many of these, natural disasters happening all across our world, and the financial and economic implication of them, really is unfortunately probably what's going to bring attention, to the issues.
Right.
Not that they're happening in the first place, but at the end of the day, that, that's where the focus needs to be, to really educate people on, it's time to step back and learn about what's happening here. It's not just
Right.
something for scientists.
Right.
Not
And also the
yeah,
understanding that, it affects everyone, but obviously there are certain groups that are going to be more affected than other, disproportionately affected. And we will go into that, but just understanding that everyone is going to be affected. So it doesn't matter how rich you are, it doesn't
right.
matter um, what privilege and power you have, you too will be affected. It just may happen at a later time.
Yep. So let's talk about that. Let's jump right in there. So how are people of color and how are women disproportionately affected by these issues globally and nationally and even, here locally around us?
Yeah. So, like we said, it's important to understand how climate change affects society and particularly groups who, let's talk about locally, but globally as well, have been disenfranchised, right? So, there's a saying in the climate movement that says those that are least responsible for climate change feel it the strongest. And so, groups that are not responsible for, burning fossil fuels are going to feel it the hardest. And so, what I mean by that is that Black people, Brown people, Indigenous folks are
Mm-hmm.
really going to feel the consequences of climate change in a more visceral way, in a more extreme manner. And so, we can think of some examples on like a micro scale and a macro scale. So, locally, if we're taking an example, let's look at New Jersey, right? Let's look at Atlantic City, which is on the coast. Um, it has a population of about 34% Black people. Poverty rate is around 40% amongst the entire population. And so when we think about the consequences of climate change, those rising sea levels are going to affect those Black folks, are going to affect those poor, low income folks, right? They're going to experience flooding in their homes, in their businesses, more devastatingly, generally because those are probably the people who are living in those low-lying areas right on the coast, right? Um, and similarly, when we think of places in New York City, like the Rockaways or other parts of Brooklyn that also are low-lying, flood during extreme rains, or when we have those rising sea levels, those are the areas that are going to be affected. I can't remember who said it, I think a scientist, or there's an article out there that says that by 2100, the Rockaways in New York are going to be completely underwater. And so that's not even 100 years from now,
Yep.
right? Going to just be completely underwater. And so globally, we can think about there's a lot of inequity when it comes to climate change. So globally, we think about the actions that we do in the US are really affecting communities in the global south. So we know that it's affecting people in the global south. So we could say that, a lot of our actions in the US are responsible for droughts and extreme weather in other places where, they're not burning fossil fuels the way that we are. But I think it's also important to think about how it's not only the consequences that are felt so strongly, but it's also the response that's given when these consequences occur. So if you think about the wildfires, right, in California, when they broke out, there was like this immediate local and national response, right? People were displaced, yes. People died, yes. But there were relief efforts that were set up to help and aid people. But then one clear example that comes into my mind is when I think about Hurricane Maria that hit Puerto Rico. The response was not the same at all. The aid was extremely slow. There are still people who are dealing with the aftermath and the after effects of Hurricane Maria. And we just think about those two communities, Puerto Rico, large island of people of color, and the areas in California where we had these wildfires, not so much who
Right.
was affected.
There was it.
And then we can even go even farther back, right? We can think about Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which completely devastated New Orleans. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's the effects of climate change, right? And we know these are pernicious, but there's also environmental racism that's not even in the background. It's really in the forefront. That's also has these really nefarious effects. And for me, I don't believe that you can talk about climate change without talking about environmental racism because they're so linked together. And so when we think about the environmental justice movement, which was started in the 1970s and 80s, was really birthed by Black communities. And so one example that comes to mind was in North Carolina, Warren County. These folks, they were poor Black folks in this tiny community, and they were trying to bring in toxic soil and sludge into their communities, and they said no. These people literally organized amongst themselves. They physically laid in the streets to stop trucks from bringing these environmental hazards into the community. And so how is that connected to the previous example is that when you have privilege and when you have power, you can say things like, not in my neighborhood. You can halt policies that allow incinerators, that allow toxic waste, that allow power plants to be built in your neighborhood. But when you think about it, a lot of communities of color, low income communities do not have the same power and privileges. And so that's why you're always finding these environmental hazards in these communities, right? And, there's countless examples of environmental racism. I mean, you could go to a map and point to any city in the US, and I'm sure there's at least like one example of environmental racism. So yes, we're fighting against the effects of climate change, but we also have to have real conversations and make real radical changes around policies that
Right.
allow environmental racism to propagate. Because these policies are effectively saying, you community are less than, and
Right.
I don't care about your health and your ability to thrive in society. And that's why I'm putting this environmental hazard in your community. And we can also take this a step further and think about how different systems of oppression have been created to arbitrarily place Blackness at the bottom and whiteness at the top. And that we have to also remove our blinders when we're engaging in climate and the climate movement and environmental justice work. Um, because we can't really be siloed, right? We have to think about climate as racial justice work because it is racial justice work and vice versa. And if we have and if we lack a deep analysis around race and the different types of systems of oppression and inequity that occur, we're not going to win this climate change. We're not going to win locally, nationally, federally, and globally. And then even within different racial groups, we already know that, women are going to be marginalized. We already know that non-binary folks are going to be marginalized. We already know that trans folks are going to be marginalized. And we already know that disabled folks are going to be marginalized. And so they're just feeling that doubly, triply.
Yeah. It's so it's I can't tell you how happy I am that we're sharing this conversation the way we are because I don't know that um people always look at it through this lens. And even those of us that do racial justice work,
Mm-hmm,
we don't immediately think about doing it in the context of this kind of environmental lens and seeing all of these policies and ways that
mm-hmm,
we can stand by you and others that are doing this work to be able to help mobilize and
mm-hmm,
support. And
mm-hmm,
for someone like me, use my privilege, to be able to support because it's clearly a very, very serious issue. And I have to say, and I know obviously I do this work, but I would hope across the country that Puerto Rico alone, when we were dealing and watching what was going on there would have, sounded some bells for people that why is this
mm-hmm,
being handled this way?
mm-hmm.
That there really is
Yeah,
there's something not right here because if it happened in this spot, we would never have seen
right.
kind of lack of response, you know.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I think it's also just like, in this country, people are very individualistic.
Yeah.
And also, if it's not happening to me or it's not happening to people that I care about or love, then I can untether myself and I
Right.
can remove myself and just be like, oh, well, it's happening because of this other thing and not because of race or other things. But, we live in a country where race is in everything, it's steeped in everything. And so, it's a privilege even to untether yourself to say, oh, well, it's not happening to me, so I don't need to worry about it. But you should be worried why people are being treated that way or they're not getting the type of mutual aid and support that they really need in such a desperate time.
Yes, for sure. So tell us, in your work as an organizer, how are you kind of hands-on, and I know it is hands-on, how are you on working to bring people together and communities together, to deal with these issues and also support people that are being impacted by this?
Yeah. So for me, being an organizer, even though, my organizing is heavily steeped in climate,
Hmm.
for me, it's very important to work at the intersections of work. And so I understand how all these different systems of oppression, I understand how these different socially progressive movements are connected. And I want to work from that intersection because that's how we're going to win, right? That's how we're going to liberate one another. And so it's a complete disservice when you're only thinking about climate and you're very siloed and you have tunnel vision on only climate and I'm not looking at
Hmm.
anything
Right,
else.
right.
And so I'm interested in all the different issues that affect communities of color and particularly Black communities by applying a climate or environmental justice lens to that work. So you could look at housing and apply a climate and environmental justice lens. You can look at mass incarceration and also apply that lens. You can look at health and also apply that lens. And so for me, I'm very passionate, obviously, about environmental racism and also just the resilience that a lot of Black and Brown communities have had in overcoming climate change while also having to deal with and navigate white supremacy and anti-Blackness and redlining and mass incarceration and inadequate access to health infrastructures. And so I think there's very valuable lessons and narratives in those stories. And that's why I became an organizer, to really uplift those voices. And so I say to myself, I want to hear those stories about people who had everything against them, but were able to still, come out on top. And when I say that from a place of love, for communities and that brilliance that has won movements. Look at the civil rights movement, have won movements and rights in the past. And I believe that we can do the same in the climate movement. And so my role as an organizer is to ensure that BIPOC, which are Black, POC, and Indigenous folks, have the same resources and accessibility that I have, because I recognize that I'm also in a place of privilege. And how can I leverage that privilege to help others that may not have that same access? And so in any talk that I give, or any training that I do, or any political education that I teach, my job is really to ensure that we're awakening an organizing orientation in people. And so I never want to be like, I'm here to just offer you education because you just don't know. And that's why you're doing XYZ, because I don't believe in that. And I'm also not a service organization. I'm not here to offer service to people, or I'm not here to tell people, you just got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and do better. No, I want people to awaken an organizing orientation in them so they can think to themselves and really navigate through a space of, if I had my own agency where I was not under this system of oppression, what would my life look like? What would I be able to achieve? And working from that place and strategizing and organizing from that place is how you win and how you liberate others. And so that's the place where I do my organizing and my political educations and my training. And then I think also the other thing that's so important is bringing in those most affected to the table. So they're the ones who should be creating the table. They're the ones who should be creating the campaigns. It shouldn't be, us huddled around, thinking through campaigns and then bring them in. No, they have that brilliance already, right? They've won fights. They've dealt with this. They've lived through this. They have that lived experience, and they should be the ones who are not only at the table, but have built the table. And then the other thing is also just like, as we're awakening that organizing orientation, really leaning in and gleaning into people who may not see themselves as organizers. They've been organizing, but they're like, oh, I don't see myself as an organizer.
Yeah.
So yeah, labeling it like you're an organizer. And so that means just creating like trainings and creating spaces to like awaken that and label themselves as that. And creating that climate lens, whether that's through a training that's training up people who've been disenfranchised, or maybe that's through doing workshops with students around environmental racism. So from a younger age, they're connecting climate to racial justice and inequity instead of later on in life.
Right, right. Well, I love that, for you, that this is about not just educating them, but kind of planting that fire in people, and then also having people recognize the fire maybe that they're already working with, and putting
Yeah.
themselves in the bucket that they actually, are in, and saying, I am an organizer, I am an activist, and, owning it.
Right.
Owning
Yeah.
and
Own
making sure,
it.
yeah, and making sure everyone's at the table. Um,
Mhm.
So tell me about this is I'm going off questions here, sorry, but
Yeah,
it,
no
it
worries.
made me
Go
it
ahead.
made me wonder. Tell me about someone who that you've met in your work that has really inspired you, and kind of kept you going. Because I think, for those of us that are in this activist world, I always say, it is hard work,
Hmm.
and it's tiring, and it's at times it's hard to keep going, but I know for myself, it's those individuals that I meet, it's the individual stories that kind of re-energize me and keep me going. What's one of the stories that or people
Hmm.
that really has fueled
Yeah.
you?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, it's a very recent example, but it's totally relevant. So actually, I in February, so around the end of February, I was in Minnesota for a whole week at this leadership school. And I was the only one from New York. And it was all these different groups that were doing a leadership training around like organizing, campaign strategizing. And so it was housing tenants associations, it was janitors, it was paraprofessionals in schools, it was nurses, it was restaurant service employees. We even had some sex workers as well that were there. So it was all these different individuals that were coming together and learning different like organizing strategies. And it was just an amazing experience because everyone there was from Minnesota or from Minneapolis or the Twin Cities, and I was the only outsider coming in. And the way that they were able to do cross movement work was so beautiful. So everyone showed up for everyone's actions. So we had nurses showing up for janitors, we had janitors showing up for Amazon warehouse workers. We had security guards showing up for environmental justice work as well. It was just this beautiful organizing experience to see how everyone was supporting one another. And they really understood the intersection of race, class, and gender. And so the first day was really steeped in that work. And that like really had a good trajectory of how the rest of the week would turn out. But it was just this amazing conglomerate of people from all different walks of life. And so I came in from a place of privilege because I'm a full-time organizer. I'm like, I get paid to organize. All these folks were just like, I organize because, you know, I'm a construction worker and I went to this organization and because to help me because my boss was stealing wages from me and I became an organizer that way. Or I work in the service industry and I'm tired of, the hours that I have to work. I'm tired of the shitty wages. I'm tired of not being able to spend time with my family because I have to work 12, 13 hours a day. And that's why I organize. Or I organize because I've had a slumlord and I want other tenants to be able to live in safe, secure housing. And so for me, it was like a mental check, because
Right.
I do this as a full-time thing. And these people are coming as organizers because of personal experience. And that's the kind of organizing that I think is so important. And that's what motivates me, is people who are like, I've been directly affected and I organize because I don't want my friends and I don't want my family to feel the same things that I have felt. And I organize because although I haven't personally experienced those things, but I want other people who have, I want to uplift that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that like reinvigorated me,
Yeah.
in moments when I'm like, oh, this work is hard. That has reinvigorated me to be like, yo, these people are still doing it, even though this is not, this isn't a profession.
Right, right, right. Wow, that's amazing. And I have to say it is amazing to, and I'm sure it was a privilege to watch kind of how, all for one and one for all, if you
Hmm.
will, that in a situation like that. And hopefully that's a message that we can leave people with today, is that, we all have to get into this into this conversation and as you said, ignite the inner activist and the inner organizer that, we
Mhm.
all
Mhm.
carry, because
Mhm.
at the end we're all connected and we have a
Mhm.
role to play
Mhm.
in turning this around for sure.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, obviously, we can't ignore, and some of the questions are coming in also from those watching about, COVID-19 and
Right.
doing this work, in the lens of where we are today. And, you know, one of the questions that came through is, how is it impacting your ability to organize right now? Because obviously, as we
Yeah.
started out talking, we're having to all do things a little bit differently because we
Right.
social distancing, right now.
Mhm.
So there's that, and then I guess there's the other question about, um, how has COVID-19 kind of our global situation, impacted this conversation as well. So you in particular, how are you
Mhm.
tweaking your modalities to do your work, but also,
Mhm.
how is the conversation now looked at through this lens?
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess I'll start with the worst. I mean, not even the worst. I guess it's the frustrating
Yeah.
that's going on. And so obviously, as an organizer, our thing is, being out in the streets, being on the ground, being with community, building relationships. And so that's not a thing right now. And so something that's been very frustrating is not being able to gather and with people, not being able to be in community and do that work. And so that's been, very frustrating. And so a lot of things have been transformed into more of a digital platform or virtual platform. But also, I recognize the inequity in that because not everyone has access to internet. Not everyone has access to computers. Not everyone has access to social media. And so I also am very cognizant of there's a real inequity in that. And not everyone is not working.
Mm-hmm.
Some people still have to go to work every day. And so there's a whole chunk of people who are being left out of this conversation around organizing. Um, there was a statistic around only like 29% of jobs in the US are actually able to work from home. And so
Yeah.
there we go. There's a huge amount of people who um, just for have to still go to work and will not be able to engage in conversations like this. And then also just people, have other things that they're dealing with when it comes to COVID. Maybe they've lost their job and they're food insecure. Maybe they don't know how they're going to be paying their rent. And so also being very cognizant about those things when I'm thinking about, oh, I want to roll out this campaign or this
Right.
training, being cognizant that there's an entire pandemic that's going on and how are we shifting that work to include those people who are affected but also have this conversation. But I think something that's also happening is that um, as an organizer, my job is to get the people who have been left out. And so that's another frustrating thing is that those that are being left out are then being left out again because of this pandemic. And so it's challenging. It's not impossible, but it's challenging. And so it's just thinking about what are creative ways for me and people at 350 and beyond, not even at
Mm-hmm.
350, just as organizers, what are ways for us to be creative so that we can still reach those people who have been left out or disenfranchised or marginalized, and how are we responding to them inside this pandemic as well as outside. And then I think for the better, the energy market crashed. I mean, yay, because this is just showing that capitalism as well as arbitrage and these huge corporations are not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
And so this pandemic has really highlighted the cracks that we have in our system, and that um, I think and I hope that people are really paying attention and seeing that, as a country, we really don't have social safety nets.
Yes.
We don't have any social safety nets. Some people have been very much against universal health care, universal childcare, about a basic universal income.
Yep.
But, I've seen how quickly, the federal government has been able to put $1.5 trillion into the stock market like this.
Yeah.
But when it comes to paying for social safety nets to help the people who are the workforce and the blood force of this country, oh, we can't pay for that. We don't have the infrastructure to pay for that. So I hope people are paying attention that we do have the means to pay for these programs. It's just that, as we've talked about, there's systems of oppression,
Right.
and we want to keep those who are poor, low income where they are. We don't want to have people thrive to a level of means, or a level of, not having to worry about paying a hospital bill, or not having to worry about who's going to take care of my child when I'm at work. And I think also what's being highlighted through this pandemic is that if you wait too long until you see the impact or the effects of something, then it's too late. And so we can't be doing the same thing when it comes to climate change. So we're seeing the dire impacts of climate change, right? We're seeing the nefarious effects. I don't think we're at that point of no return yet, but we're getting there. And if we keep waiting until it's just like the point of no return, we're going to be in the same situation that we are in for this pandemic. So hopefully this pandemic can be a learning experience for people.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I was going to say. I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
you raised it so well. I mean, we know that there are systems that, as a nation, we can consider, to be
Mm-hmm.
making change. And this issue that we're in right now has very quickly put the spotlight on, some of
Mm-hmm.
the kind of kinks, that we're living with every
Mm-hmm.
day. And so that is actually a really important place for people to be thinking about when they're voting. In
Yes.
that, for sure. I mean, when we talk about that, like, connection piece of this, is that um, we shouldn't have to wait for this kind of crisis to happen for us to suddenly be looking at all of these conversations that have been happening for years, but no one has been bringing them, to the
Right.
as real
Right.
solutions because of other issues. So it's definitely something for voters to be educating themselves on who are the candidates out there, that are willing to have these conversations and bring them to the table, for sure. So
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
so
Yeah.
yes. So tell me, in the midst of you know everything going on, I know that we've kind of halted a lot and are so focused on the pandemic, but are there any pieces of legislation or policies happening on the state or federal level that we should be watching and making our phone calls and writing our postcards and sending emails to really get people
Mhm.
to be thinking about pushing and bringing attention to?
Yeah. So there are a few pieces of legislation at the federal level, but I wouldn't call them promising.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think that if whoever has time, I think people should read the policies. And I have the names, and I'll let you know what they are. You should read the policies and dig in deep. But I don't, at 350 specifically, they're not policies that are really going to bring about the change that we need, and are not really going to affect climate the way that we need it to be affected. And so the three pieces that are out right now are called HR 5435, American Public Lands and Waters Climate Solution Act of 2019. There's the Clean Future Act, and then there's the American Energy Innovation Act. And so on your own time, you can get through the nitty gritty of each one. But overall, all the policies have issues, and they're not really fighting against the real issues of climate change. Some of them still are offering fossil fuel infrastructures and fossil fuel um, alternatives around, like, liquid natural gas and things like that. And then it's also important to think about that the Senate and the House are Republican, and that the chances of passing any kind of radical legislation are going to be very slim right now, right? So when we're thinking of looking forward to 2021, it's really important that we flip, right? And that we're really electing people, not only federally but locally. I think a lot of people forget about how important local elections are too, around what types of legislation have a very strong climate, racial justice, equity focus. All that being said, there still is time to rally behind legislation like a Green New Deal that was offered in 2019. And that's a piece of legislation that's heavily steeped in racial justice and equity. And in New York, there's actually a coalition of groups that I'm a part of, which is a movement for Green New Deals for New York. And there's four demands. One is a transition to 100% renewables. One is a ban of all fossil fuel infrastructure, old and new. One is building public power amongst communities, so training up community members to lobby behind state senators and assembly people. And then the last is taxing the rich. Like the 1% should be paying for these new infrastructures around 100% renewable energy. It should not be low income, poor communities who are paying for this. And then I think another thing that people can be doing in New Jersey and New York and just across nationally is calling your assembly people, is calling your state senators and asking them to support bills that divest from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are dirty. It's dirty energy. It does us no good. It causes climate change, and we can't continue to use these sources of energy. There are other sources of energy that do not cause the same effects. And so, having state senators who are on board of divesting from fossil fuels, but also if we're thinking about racial justice and equity, divesting from prisons and also divesting from corporate bailouts and really investing in communities and investing in health care infrastructures and investing in clean climate solutions that are going to help communities who have been disenfranchised and who are affected most by climate change.
Well, as we're kind of getting ready to wrap up,
Mm-hmm.
and I can tell from again some of the comments that we're getting too. I mean, whether we have individuals who now you know, you've gotten their fire within their inner activist burning, your, important information that you're sharing and your passion, which, is so key. Or whether it's organizations like the YWCA of Northern New Jersey and other organizations that may, not necessarily see themselves as part of the climate change bucket, but suddenly, based on our
Mm-hmm.
conversation today, hopefully are seeing the intersection of it
Mm-hmm.
all. And again, all for one for all, and how it is all like puzzle pieces that snap together, for the future.
Mm-hmm.
What are some concrete ways? And you mentioned some legislation. We can add some of those pieces into the comments
Mm-hmm.
so that people can know. Just for anybody watching,
Mm-hmm.
add some of that. And we can talk to Dominique afterwards, and put some links in for you for
Yeah,
sure.
definitely.
But so think about the individuals and think about the organizations. What are two messages that you would wrap us up with to say, how people can get involved and really like take some meaningful action on this issue and support this work?
Yeah, there's so many ways, and obviously locally, locally, grassroots organizing is one of the best ways to get involved. If you're looking for a more climate focused, um, organization, in New Jersey, there's 350 Rockland. If you don't live in Rockland, you can start your own group too. You can be like, hey, like we talked earlier about Atlantic City is a region that's going to be heavily affected by climate. You can start a group in 350 in Atlantic City. Um, Also, another way is get involved with Earth Day. And I saw there was
Yeah,
a question about Earth Day.
I was.
And yes, everything is going to be virtual now. And so originally it was going to be, so it starts April 22nd. the 23rd and 24th. It was going to be 3 different days of mobilizations in the streets, but obviously we are not going to be doing that. And so it's going to be a 72-hour live stream event.
Wow.
Yeah, and once, more details get hammered out, I can definitely share that information, but definitely look out for that. The Thursday of Earth Day, which is the 23rd, will be heavily focused on finance and climate. And so we'll be directly targeting JP Morgan Chase and BlackRock and Liberty Mutual, who are responsible for financing and supporting fossil fuel industries around climate. And so definitely look out for that work. And I think also during this time is really thinking about, there's a lot of ways to utilize digital platforms like this Facebook Live, like social media, to organize. And I think that because we can't be in person with one another, navigating to this is the next best thing that we can do. But I think for everyone, what I would say is, think during this time, because we can't gather, it's a great time for like self-reflection, right? And think about in your region, what are the things that are needed and what are the things that are missing? And think about how can you position yourself to either fulfill that need or support others that can. So maybe you're in a position of a authority position, or you're in a position of power, and you recognize that someone else may be able to fulfill some type of need or niche within your community, and get that work started. I think also through this pandemic, we've seen that there's been a lot of mutual aid programs that have been started up, particularly in New York, and I'm sure in New Jersey as well, and different advocacy that's truly intersectional. And so there's been a group of organizers in New York that's been coming together to talk about mutual aid and resources that's touching on climate, that's touching on housing, that's talking about mass incarceration, which talking about healthcare infrastructures. And then also I'm a trainer, right? And I love to train people. And so during this time, think about, is there a training that you need? Is there some type of information that you want to go deeper and deep dive into it? And if you're interested in a specific training or organizing, then yes, hit me up. I can provide my information. Let me know. And I would be more than happy to create like that virtual
Mhm.
platform for people, so that, when this pandemic is over, we can hit the streets and still be able to mobilize and utilize this momentum that we've created. And then the last thing is, get involved with your local housing tenants associations, or people who are working for equity housing for all. Get involved with groups who are doing racial justice work around mass incarceration. Get involved with your local YWCA. There's all these different places and organizations that are doing amazing work. And if they don't have a climate lens, you can provide that climate lens, or I can offer a lens to that. And so there's so many different ways to do that intersectional work. And it's just a matter of, seeking that out.
Yeah, finding the one that makes the most sense for where you are,
Right,
for sure.
right. Find your
Well,
niche. Find your
yeah,
niche.
exactly, exactly. And
Mhm.
as we started this conversation, the two of us before we went live, for the YWCA, this is the beginning of a relationship and a beginning of a conversation. And I'm grateful that our national organization had done this report and put it in front of us so that we even ourselves as an organization could really think about
Mhm.
what is our role in this discussion and the intersection of
Yeah.
these two pieces and how we can bring more attention and energy, in a positive way
Mhm.
around, making
Mhm.
movement on these issues. So we
Mhm.
are very grateful to you for taking this time this morning. And I'm
Well,
sure that you'll be, hearing from lots of folks. Those of you watching, the information for Dominique's organization, 350.org, will be linked to this post. And you can go to their website, follow them on social media, connect with
Mhm.
Dominique as well. So, she obviously has a lot of tricks in her bag and ways that she can help you as an individual or
Mhm.
your organization that you're connected to, learn and, be inspired to take action for this work that's so important.
Mhm.
Here at the YWCA, I want to thank our partners that have banded with us to bring you this event today. The National Coalition of Black Women, the Bergen Passaic Chapter, Center for Food Action, the League of Women Voters, Fairleigh Dickinson University, Age Friendly Englewood, Bergen Community Action Team, Planned Parenthood Action Fund of New Jersey, and Bergen Community College. Even just from the course of this conversation and thinking about our partners that stood up to want to support this event, you can see how together we weave a really strong net that can really catch our community and help support us through better solutions for these issues. So thank you to our
Mhm.
partners, for everyone who joined us. Again, we're thinking of everyone where you're at, and there's a whole continuum of how people are experiencing this time that we're
Mhm.
in, and wherever you are, we stand with you. Please reach out if the YWCA can provide some support for you during this time, and stay well, stay healthy. We will see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. We will be joined by the CEO of Newbridge Medical Center, Deb Visconti, to talk a little bit about ways during this, challenging time that we can bring some sunshine and brightness to individuals that are isolated right now, that are connected to facilities like Newbridge Medical Center, and our school age program team member, Miss Daniela, will be joining with a craft that kids can do that we can send to bring some hope and brightness to the days of individuals that, again, are isolated at this time. So we encourage you to join us during that time and continue to watch us during our YWTV offerings that we'll be doing daily while we're living separately, as we say.
Mhm.
Dominique, thank
Mhm.
you again so much for
Yes.
your time and sharing all that you've learned, and again, being an inspiration to all of us.
Mhm.
I know all of us in this world, we do get our energy and get our re-energy hearing conversations like this. I know
Mhm.
personally you've exploded lots of ideas in my head, from this discussion. And I hope that that's happening for everyone who's listening. We all have a responsibility and an opportunity,
Mhm.
to
Yes.
impact this issue. And I hope that we've encouraged people to continue to learn more and to do, to take action.
Yeah. Thank you for having me
Thank
so much.
you. Be well.
Yes. Thank you.
Talk soon. Bye bye, everyone.
Mhm.
Planned.